it doesn't fit. What is this hat, this theme here anyway? Oh, sorry, I didn't see you all there. I was just having a little trouble putting my hat on. It doesn't really right size. I'm not sure thematically this is what I want to do in work, but come to think of it, this actually reminds me of the problem that we have with interpretive training, where one size doesn't necessarily fit every head. And I should know, I've participated in this problem for a few years, back when I started interpretation training in 1997 with an organization called the Rare Center for Tropical Conservation. And we had these huge, elaborate guide training. They were $200,000 intervention, 70 days, teaching staff of 8 people. And it was for local people around national parks. They would come in, spend all the time, teach them English, teach interpretation, conservation, this and that. We did it in Mexico and Honduras and Guatemala. But in the end, I'm not sure that Cadillac, as it was called, with guide training, was really that effective, despite the huge cost. But over the years, since moving on from RARE, 2003, I've participated in interpretive training in other countries, in Bolivia, and Costa Rica, and Texas. This is not a country anymore, but it used to be. And in each of those places, I was always working, trying to promote interpretation as a development tool. Since I started working in the conservation field and never really left. And I started to realize over time that one size doesn't fit all. And matter of fact, there shouldn't even be one size or one hat for everybody. And that lesson now I'm taking to Colombia next week, where we'll be trying to set up a national interpretive training course with their National Training Institute. As soon as I leave here, I have to go and change hats. And I'm going in the capacity of the coordinator of the Global Heritage Consortium. Very briefly, what this international or global virtual nonprofit is attempting to do is uniting people and organizations from around the world who are interested or even dedicated in introducing emerging paradigms into the heritage national cultural field to improve planning and management, to try and stem the crisis that we have of plans just piling up all around on office shelves, never getting implemented. And actually interpretation is a really large component of that work that we do. And we've developed a series of principles, which I'll be sharing with you, some of them at least, during this presentation, and how we can get beyond this one hat for many heads syndrome. Now, I suspect a number of you actually came here to see Marisol Mayorga and not me. Well, I have to admit that was a bit of a marketing ploy, because she's not here. But she is a co-author of this. The reason she's not here is because she's back getting her PhD at Kansas State, studying very hard, and also our 2 kids. So I guess there's a relationship there. And ironically enough, her advisor's here, but it left her at home. But aside from getting her PhD in interpretation, she was for 5 years the director of environmental interpretation at the biology school in the University of Costa Rica, which is still today the only place in Latin America you can get a postgraduate degree in interpretation. So there isn't a lot of opportunities out there. She's also, while she's trying to study, writing a textbook on environmental interpretation with a college publisher in Costa Rica. But even though she's not here, this presentation, or a similar, more primitive version of it, we gave in the international conference in Sigtuna, Sweden. I don't think any of you were there that I remember, but even if you were, well, you were there, I don't know if you were in my presentation. Yes. You were. Well, this is better than it was then. We had things falling off the wall and computer failures and stuff like that. But anyway, I solved most of those problems, I hope, if nothing falls off the wall. So anyway, back to the point of this one hat for many heads generates a number of different problems. Now, to illustrate this problem, I'm going to need some help from you guys. We're a small group, so this should work well. So I'd like to get 3 volunteers to start out here. Come on up here, please. It's 3 people, so I don't have to pick them. Picking volunteers is a pastime of mine anyway. So if you could stand right here. There. Sure. Welcome. So yeah, you guys are my students here, and we're going to have a training. Here you go. Try on this training hat. See how well it fits. Well, maybe it doesn't fit so well. And I don't know if piracy is part of your normal interpretive programming, but that's all I have to offer. So I hope it's useful for you. I like the innovation, putting it backwards. I hope this is useful for you and your site. So go back to your sites and good luck. And of course, make sure you pay them when you leave. No, take that. Of course, I didn't say take that out.
Oh, wow.
You're going to have to use that hat because that's your only training you're going to get. Now, this idea of one hat or not training correctly appears all the time, especially. Probably not just in the developing world where I work, but in the developed world as well. For example, this is a case that Marisol sent along to share with you. This is a former student of hers at the University of Costa Rica whose thesis project was to work with some local fishermen, largely illiterate. So she was putting together her curriculum for these fishermen, and she submitted it to her professor. And her idea was, well, I'm going to put the things into that curriculum that I was taught myself at the university. It's good enough for me, it's good enough for them. And then when Marisol saw that, she's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Are you really sure this audience needs to know about national parks in the United States? Are you really sure that they need to know who Tilden is and to understand his principles? So she stepped back and thought, well, maybe that's not right for this audience. So we averted a problem in that particular case. In this case, I didn't avert a problem. This is my fault. This is working in Colombia with national park guides with USAID. And here we have Osvaldo. Osvaldo is one of those guides, but this is one of the most charismatic guides I've ever seen. This man has a radio voice that even when he burps, you go, wow, this man is good. He tells stories. He is so eloquent. And definitely the best storyteller in the entire group. But when it came to trying to write an interpretive message, he could not get beyond the topic. Birds. Birds with wings. Birds in Colombia. Birds in Colombia that migrate. He just couldn't get it. As hard as we tried, he could not write an interpretive message. That one hat that the three of you now have hidden, I noticed, didn't fit him very well at all. So what we're really talking about is we need to have multiple hats, right, for multiple heads, and actually multiple kinds of clothing too, which I'll get to a little bit later, in order to generate what I call effective, or what Marisol and I will call effective environmental or interpretive programming or products. What do I mean by that? Well, we assume that effective interpretive products means interpretation that actually helps managers, whether they be tour operators or whether they be site managers, to meet their management objectives. That's how we're defining it. I'm going to assume also that because this is an NAI conference, not too many people are going to disagree with that, so I'm not going to defend or support that. We're just going to leave it out there. Does anyone disagree with that? Okay, good. Then you can stay. So, to carry on, just like we don't interpret for a general audience, we should not train for a general interpreter. Now let me throw out another assumption here, that pretty much all of you understand or even have participated in the process of human physical development. Right? How many parents you get out there? All right, well, there's a couple that seem to be shy about that. You know, shy about that. Okay. You know, the idea where a couple parents get together and they conceive of the idea of having a family and and you end up with a baby. So I don't think anybody disagrees or doesn't understand that idea. And probably nobody disagrees or understands the idea that once you have a baby, then not only are they going through a physical development process for the next 20-something years, but they're also going through a mental development process, at least through the next 20 years. And as most of us know, when the baby first comes out, pretty much just operates on instinct. And then as the baby gets older, it starts passing through different developmental stages. For example, between the ages of 4 and 7, more or less, children develop the capacity to use imagery and symbols and representation. You know, this girl is using this baby, pretending it to be real, but she knows it's not a real baby. She knows this baby represents a real baby, but it isn't actually a real baby. So as they get a little older, from 7 to 14, they get into another stage where their self-identity is based on roles. You know, I am a student, I am a child, I am a soccer player. It's all about roles, and that's where their self-identity. And of course, they need to first get through the imagery symbolism before they can get to this stage, and then this stage before they get into the subsequent stages. But the funny thing is a lot of people believe that once you get to adulthood, the mental development pretty much stops. It might be true for the people who believe that, but it doesn't have to be that way. Matter of fact, we can continue developing our mental abilities through the rest of our life if we make the effort and we try. In fact, this idea of mental development continuing throughout life and going to higher and higher stages is an idea that's thousands of years old. Great ancient traditions have meticulously mapped out higher levels of achievement, higher levels of consciousness. For example, the Zen Buddhists. So this is not a new idea in any sense of the imagination. And in fact, in the past 100 years, the field of development psychology has run crazy with this idea. The developmental psychologists, you may have heard of names like Piaget, or Maslow, or Kohlberg, and dozens of others who you probably haven't heard of unless you're in that field. They've come up with this whole series of different scales of different semi-independent mental capacities that develop over time. Just to give you a small example, you've got emotional development over time, moral development, kinesthetic development, relational, spiritual, aesthetic, cognitive development. Now, all these development psychologists, though, they all agree on at least 3 points about all of these dozens of scales. The first thing is you can't skip a stage. You can't just go from here to here suddenly overnight, because each stage lays the groundwork for the following stages. But they also recognize that different people can go through these stages at different speeds. Some people have a long time getting their emotions going, and other people, they say, they're mature before they're years. You've all heard that expression. And the third thing is, and that's most important for this particular talk today, is that different people end at different stages. Some people might just end here, and they're there for the rest of their life. And other people may make it up to this level by the time that their time expires. So they end at different times. And we might say, well, in this group, in terms of cognitive, well, let me give you an example of a cognitive one, the one that's probably most useful for us. Maybe you've heard of Bloom's taxonomy? Bloom's taxonomy is one of multiple cognitive scales. And here he's talking about, well, the lowest order of thinking is just remembering. And that's a level that we share with all animals, right? And even microorganisms have a certain ability to remember through conditioning. Then there's understanding what it is that you're remembering. And two, we share that with higher animals, other mammals. You've all seen mice going through labyrinths, and monkeys and crows doing these very elaborate learning experiments where they're sort of understanding and even applying. I'm not going to argue how far non-humans go, but suffice it to say, you get to a point where humans alone are able to analyze what they've applied, evaluate whether it's good or bad. That's certainly only human. And then create new knowledge based on that evaluation. This is good, and I'm going to create new knowledge. But not everybody gets up to these levels. Some people just stop down here. Might be fair to say that in this group we probably have a variety of different levels that we've achieved. But given the audience, it's probably also fair to say that most of us tend to be towards the top end of that scale. But when we look at the rest of the world, and we take developing countries into consideration as well, where education isn't as good, then we see people distributed across all of these scales, even the lower ones. We find people distributed all across. So that means then, if we have people at different cognitive levels, and in this case I said in the title education, only because education correlates pretty well with cognitive, not always. You can have a genius with no educational background, of course. But those are the exceptions rather than the rules. So if we have people at different cognitive levels, that means they have the mental infrastructure capable of doing certain kinds of functions, certain kinds of things. And in the case of interpretation, there are a lot of very high order thinking requirements to do good interpretation, not mediocre interpretation, but good. So that means different kinds of people are capable of doing some of these things, and other people really aren't capable. Osvaldo is not capable of doing message writing, which is a very high order, if they're really good messages, that is, a very high order thinking capacity. So this means that the people at different levels then need and create different kinds of knowledge for that's consonant with their particular level. I mean, for example, did those illiterate fishermen really need to know about Tilden and the principles? Could they have even understood the concepts behind Tilden's principles? Well, we never actually tested it, but I tend to think that they probably could not have, and that would not have been an appropriate training. Not necessarily something they need or something that they could even use. So what we essentially have then is we could say that there's a variety of different kinds of interpretation providers out there. We do different kinds of things. And each of these providers, based on their cognitive level, can achieve or can provide certain kinds of functions based on what they're capable of doing that contribute to interpretation. Well, what do I mean by providers? Let me just see. So you can see here an 8-year-old and a 2-year-old, and their mental capacities are very different, and what they're able to do is very different. Since Marisol right now is trying to manage them both using very different applications alone, which I regret, but not enough that I didn't come. Such is the reality. So now I need to, before moving on, well, no, not before moving on, I just wanted to show you this taxonomy of providers that we've come up with. Now this is an idealized taxonomy. It's sort of averaged for the whole world. In different contexts, you will perhaps modify them in different ways. And this table is in the NAI source book. So starting at really from bottom to top or top to bottom, we have the local guides, fishermen, farmers, former hunters, local women's groups. Again, people who tend to be very undereducated. Park guides, guards guides, seasonal interpreters. That means people who are part-time interpreters as opposed to full-time, as opposed to national or professional guides. I'll discuss a little bit what these are in a moment. Professional interpreters, although hopefully the titles are somewhat self-explanatory. An instructor, and then the researcher, or academic. Now there really should be a dark line right here because the next one isn't the top of the pinnacle, is not the pinnacle of this list. It's sort of almost a different category. It would be supervisors, managers of tour companies, or site managers. So these is the taxonomy of different kinds of providers that we have, and of course at home you can modify it as you see. But before that, I would like to have 3 more volunteers. 3 different volunteers. Could I get 3 different volunteers? Because now we have our next stop, where we now understand and hopefully agree that one hat for many heads doesn't work. So, one more volunteer? Yeah. Oh, sorry. I'll find a role for you later.
Okay.
You're the one I sat next to last night at the awards, right? No, I don't.
No, I don't.
Okay. Anyway, so now let's try a little more advanced. Now we can have different hats for different heads, and these hats have different themes, and the hats are adjustable too. Try them on, see if we can get them to work. Yeah, see, look at that. This is a better fit for these guys. And if you want, I guess in theory, to use the metaphor, you could exchange hats and choose the one that's most appropriate. This is recreation planning, the Mesoamerican Ecotourism Alliance, and World Cup Soccer. You're international, so you probably appreciate that even more than your average American. You went crazy in Costa Rica this year. But anyway, that's another story. So hopefully now we're adapting a little bit better to the needs of these different guys, and hopefully this will be more useful. But let's just say go back to your sites and good luck.
Thank you.
And again, don't forget to pay on your way out. That's a little warm for that. Wasn't it? So let's go back to the table here, and let's look roughly at these education levels. And again, it'll vary with place and place. So these local guides have low or no formal education, correlated with usually low or very low income, and their guiding is typically part-time, but they mix it with other economic pursuits. Typically poor people have to use a variety of incomes to meet their needs. Park guards, guides, seasonal interpreters, high school, limited college training. I realize in the United States, seasonal is almost always, or will always have college level, but around the world that's definitely not the case. And even in the United States, you can switch the scale a little bit because the professional interpreters will tend to be more educated than the seasonal, at least in terms of interpretation. So you have your national or professional guides, and you may not be familiar, but in the tourism world, oftentimes you have one guide who's capable of going to many parts of the country, or even many different countries. This is the person who leads the tours and does all the logistics, and typically comes from a city and is highly educated. Even in the most underdeveloped countries, this is the case. Then you have the professional interpreters, a lot like us, tend to have advanced degrees, or at least advanced training on top of their college degree. Instructors of interpreters, they should be college educated, and they should also have advanced education in training and in teaching, hopefully, or instructing for adults. The researchers generally would have a terminal academic degree, and supervisors are college educated. So you see there are different, even though you might shift exactly who has what, there are different educational levels that roughly map onto different cognitive levels. And it is also interesting, too, that there are other skill areas and knowledge areas that correlate with education that are useful for guys. I mean, is it not true that typically the more educated one is, the more understanding they have about the world? Perhaps the more passionate, the more literate they are, passionate for learning, for reading, more experienced traveling, perhaps, understanding other perspectives. You know, all of these things are very useful tools for an interpreter or for a guide. And some of them are closely and some of them are loosely attached to the level of education that they have. So what are some implications so far in this presentation? Well, one is, it's very hard to change someone, to move them from one level to another. As a matter of fact, it's really hard for us to do it to ourselves. Because once you reach adulthood, you typically don't go up levels quickly at all. And oftentimes, if you don't have a need, you don't move at all, unless you actually make an effort. You actually make an effort to improve your cognitive skills, or a common example would be studying for spiritual practices to increase your level of consciousness. So that it's very hard to change people. Another implication is, and this leads into the first principle of our organization for training and performance building, would be meet people where they are. We've already established that people have different cognitive levels, different moral levels, different spiritual levels, different languages, different cultures, and just whatever one hat for everybody doesn't really work. Understanding your audience, tailoring to the audience. And to give you the full quote, and this is a spiritual teacher, you have to meet people where they are, and sometimes you have to lead them there. You cannot have the ambition of changing people if they're not ready to change, if they don't want to change. So we have to adapt our training accordingly. And then, of course, as I said, the last implication, the most important, is people with different education levels will be able to offer different things to the overall interpretation product. Now, I have to admit, not everybody agrees with this approach. There may even be in this room here, but definitely in this conference, there's consultants out there who do trainings, and they prefer just to have one hat for many audiences, or just a few hats for many different. I mean, after all, it's far more economical, far more lucrative to do it that way. And in the literature, this way has been alternately called the prescriptive method of instruction, or the teacher-centered of instruction, or even the industrial form of training. And if your goal is simply to make money, then actually that really is the best way to do it. But it doesn't necessarily lead to better interpretation. Others don't want to deal with the messiness of working with human development. I mean, it's kind of complicated. I spent 10 years before I even realized what I was doing. So, and sometimes people just don't feel like that's the thing for them. And there's a third group of people who they see these hierarchies, that some people are smarter than others, and they get really violent because they don't like hierarchies. They think it's elitist, it's not egalitarian, it's not fair to categorize and pigeonhole people in those different groups. While there may be ethical issues involved, the point I want to make is, well, whoever you are, you have to understand what your objectives and what your priorities are. What are your objectives? And to answer for myself and for Marisol here in her invisible form, once again, we want effective interpretation programming that improves or helps the development of individuals and organizations to better manage and protect natural and cultural heritage. That's what I want. That's what we want at this organization. That's what we're trying to maximize. What do I mean by development? For me, development means organizations and people, their capacity to change the way they think and the way they behave to acquire the results they truly desire. That's how I'm defining development in this case, in terms of organizations and people. Being able to change themselves to better obtain the results they truly desire. In this case, in terms of managing heritage. So this brings us to the next PUP principle. Yeah, this is the industrial approach. I think we've all probably seen it in college. is to embed training in a larger development process, rather than be just isolated and one-off. And to follow up a quote, to optimize the whole, we must sub-optimize the parts. Deming, the master of lean technology. And maybe to use a quote that's even a little more familiar to us, interpretation should aim to present the whole rather than a part, and must address itself to the whole man or woman rather than any phase. So what these quotes are saying is, or implying, is that maybe there's a more holistic way we can train. You know, what is this whole that we're searching for? I mean, there's some whole that helps manage culture and nature, or heritage, better than just training individual people. And that's what we're shooting for. Well, before we go a little deeper into try and figure out what that whole is, let's get back to our table and continue building it out. So what are the different functions of these different providers? Well, the first one, and this one took me years to understand, even though now it seems so darn obvious, that local guides, the principal function usually is they are the heritage. You know, they're not representing, I mean, they're not in the sense of going and interpreting the heritage. Like a seasonal who comes from Utah and goes to work in California, they're not representing that. They're not part of that California heritage, right? But the local guides generally are, and when a visitor is with a local guide, they feel closer to that heritage because that heritage created that person, if we can say it that way. You don't understand what I'm saying? It's like they're part and parcel of that. So the stories that they tell and the demonstrations are just extensions of the authentic heritage that the visitor is going to visit, independent of whether they're actually using interpretation or not. They are part of that heritage. So then you have the park guard, seasonal interpreters, and they're executing interpretive programs, oftentimes designed by others. In reality, they're oftentimes executing their own programs, but they probably shouldn't be, because they tend to be often low quality. But in the ideal world, these locals, part-timers, are executing programs at least guided by higher level interpreters, if not completely designed by them. A national or professional guide, these are already experienced in designing experiences. Just the notion of understanding the experience of somebody else, especially from their not your culture, is a higher order thinking capacity. As you'll see as we go down, except for a supervisor, we're employing higher order thinking skills. National guides have to link local guides. When you have an itinerary that goes across the country, you have to link the different local guides together. You have to have your interpretive program, and national guides perhaps are even message writing. You have your professional interpreter, or they're in the planning, designing, interpreter, writing, guiding, and testing new tools. They're at reach the level where they can test new interpretive tools and theory. The instructor has to do everything else, plus they have to be trained in adult education, or they should be. You can see this is idealized. There's an awful lot of instructors who couldn't name a single principle of adult education, my guess. The researcher, they are researching, providing theory and tools to the profession that then need to be tested by people who actually work in the field. If this doesn't happen, you all know, a lot of times these ideas just stay in the academic journals and they never go anywhere because nobody's actually applying them and testing them to see how they work and how they can be applied. And of course we have the supervisor, managed heritage areas. They have to integrate interpretation into managed functions. They have to be good consumers of interpretation, although not necessarily interpreters themselves. Because if they don't understand it, well, we all know the consequences of that. Interpreters end up being a second thought, first thing to be cut. So very, very quickly, I want to go through this quickly because you can read this in more detail later. The skills, knowledge area, the local guides have to be oriented people in the field, hospitality, receive tourists. They have to know, well, sometimes they have to know first aid, sometimes emergency plans, although that's usually the national guide. I need to change that. The knowledge of their own heritage, have to have some communication skills, and these guys have to be able to structure their presentation to some degree, understand their audience to some degree, use messages, not necessarily write them, develop simple story structures, know cultural and natural history. These guys have to do all of the above, plus they have to do product planning, analysis, understanding different markets. They're usually bilingual, etc. Professional interpreters have to have an academic understanding of the field as well as everything above, which doesn't require an academic understanding, and again, a higher order skill. and much more advanced communication skills. The instructor, all of this plus teaching and understanding learning. Human development should be important for the instructor, mental development. The researcher, of course, has to have research skills and expertise in the academic area related to interpretation. And the supervisor has to be able to manage experiences, understand the role of interpretation, capable of recognizing quality interpretation, what's good and what's bad, and they need to be, as I mentioned before, with consumers of interpretation. So, let's see, what's our intermediary conclusion at this point? Well, we now realize we have to have different hats for different heads, right? But that's still not enough. That's what NAI does currently, different hats for different heads. And perhaps NAI's objectives are different than this. That's another conversation. But if we're trying to achieve development, then training in isolation violates adult education principles, holistic training principles, and development principles. So actually, if we want development to happen, then one-off, isolated, even using multiple hats, will generally not get us there. Well, okay, well, what do we have to do then with multiple hats and multiple heads? Well, I've already argued that different people have different functions, and in fact, these functions work together to get an interpretive product. Well, let's see what I mean by that. A couple of years ago, I worked with Rios Tropicales, which is a tour operator in Costa Rica. They offer very high-quality rafting, and they wanted to increase their quality by also offering interpretive stuff, since nobody else in Costa Rica does it, believe it or not. So we wanted to design an intervention, a training that was integrated, considering different functions of different people that would work together, sort of as a team. So I had to work with the supervisors, that is the owners, to write the messages, to understand that the different elements need to work together to produce a market-ready product. That's what our measure of success for the guides was producing a market-ready product. And then the local guides with no college education, but the rafters, they were in the course, and then you had a guy from their office who's college educated, and although he wasn't a professional interpreter, he got it. I mean, he had higher order thinking skills, and very rapidly was the best person in the course. And the idea was, after this 1 week workshop, then the next several months would be mentoring while these guides produce an actual product. Because the learning doesn't really happen in a course. According to the organizational learning field, the definition of learning, and there are different definitions, is modification of your behavior. You do something, you make a mistake, you change the way you do it, and you modify your behavior so you get closer to your goals. So constructivist knowledge is nice, but tour operators don't care about that. And really, managers can't do anything with better knowledge if it doesn't actually turn into changing behavior on the ground. So this was the idea, was to combine the supervisors with the upper level interpreter with the local guides so that at the end a product could come out and be available for market. Unfortunately, and this is where I probably failed, the owners didn't write the message, so I tried. They didn't show up for the course to understand it better. They didn't orient the local guides as to what they were doing, so the local guides were shocked when they arrived. This guy did really well, but then they wouldn't let him leave the office, so he couldn't help the local guides in the field. And then they thought, well, we have too much business coming, so I don't think I can give the time to the guys. Anyway, the guys didn't want to do it because they only get paid for their work time. They don't get paid for training. All these guys had to pay for it themselves. And then you know. So the idea of integrating as a team was there, but on this particular occasion, it sort of broke down. But this leads us to the next principle. Assume the long-term mentoring perspective. Again, in adult education, you realize that you don't learn things in a 4 or 5 day course. What you learn is going into the field and making a mistake and applying it in your situation with the other people on your team. Because nobody works alone. I think we all work in teams. So for that, second, get up one more element here. I forgot to bring it, which would be extraordinarily embarrassing. Oh, I didn't forget. So the 3 people with the different hats, if you could come forward once again to help me demonstrate. With your hats. So we now know they have different heads. And if you stand over here, come on, over here. Yeah, come on. It's a big audience. So different hats and different heads, but we now know that training them, even with different heads isolated, probably won't result in differences on the ground. So what we need to do is train them as a team. Here you go. You can actually take the paper off the back and stick it on your shirts. So you're now the Pup Global Heritage Team. I'm not sure how easy it is to get a sticker on.
It's a challenge.
Yeah. Well, that should be a component of the training. Yeah, you can just drop it in here. Oh, yeah. Well, don't want to cover it up or it might not, you might not see your name again. So now we train them as a team. And hopefully our results will be better because now there are different levels, different hats, and they have complementary function. And we need, as you saw in the case of Rios Tropicales, local guides and different people working together. So as a team now, you can just stand here and we'll just hope that something happens. Now, even though they have a uniform and we're trying to be more holistic by training them as a team, in fact, and it's not nearly as reductionist as before. In fact, and I want to show you some examples of how things fail when this doesn't happen. First, of course, I have to mention this quote from Sophocles, "One must learn by doing the thing, for though you think you may know it, you have no uncertainty until you try." So just because you think you learned something coming out of a course, a one-off isolated course, it may not actually be the case. So here we go. These are some very experienced hands, as you can see. This is 83 years of pottery experience. I love that picture. So you got different hats, different heads, working as a team, very much like a soccer team, right? You have your defenders, your offenders. That doesn't sound quite right.
Attackers.
Yeah, but then your attackers. You have your goalie, and even you have your coaches. And if we just train them in isolation, these different functions, that team will fail, clearly. So they need to be trained as individuals, but also trained as a team. You can see here. So here we have a particular case in Costa Rica, the National Training Institute, which is responsible for training tour guides, and this trainer is giving a class in interpretation, and she herself was never trained in interpretation. So she, who's the instructor, never actually worked with an instructor or with a professional interpreter. So, and then we have the local guides too. So this is not a good meshing of the different functions. Another case that Marisol gives us from her school, the biology school, was that the biology school wanted to create an exhibition to promote what the biology school does for incoming students. So they wanted to design an exhibit. So the director of the school started to put together this team and never invited anybody from the interpretation program. Marisol went berserk, and she lobbied pretty hard and eventually got on the team. And this is a prototype. But at the beginning, because the supervisor had no training in interpretation, he didn't even realize what it was, that it was even related to exhibits, and almost had another disaster. There's some other examples here that I don't have photo for. Let's go through them a little quickly. Sending guides back home where the supervisors don't know what they learned. It's kind of like going to a conference, right? You get all excited about this idea. You go back to your organization, you're like, yeah, whatever. I mean, that's happened to me quite a few times. How about developing products with no interpretive plan? Or professional guides who have no connection to the literature, the academic literature. Or tour operators who hire national guides because they don't think local guides are of any use. Or local guides who have no connection to tour operators or national guides and thus have no access to the market and thus can't really practice interpretation or tourism. Or instructors of interpretation who have no idea how to manage a site. Or academics who have nobody to test their theories or their tools. Or interpretive planners who do these plans and don't consult any other providers, which leads to failed plans. So all of these different cases lead to failure because you have only one, or maybe two, but one function not working with the other functions. So this leads us to the next principle, which basically I've already said. We want to train teams more than individuals. Of course, this is more complicated, obviously. And here we have one of my favorite quotes. Steve Kerr is a very big name in the organizational learning world, Chief Learning Officer for General Electric. Never send a changed person back to an unchanged environment. Yet 99% of training breaks that rule. He's referring to the for-profit sector. Does that sound familiar at all to our other sectors? Anyway, you don't have to answer that out loud. So once again, training one-off is easier to do. And in fact, one of the big theorists in consultancy named Peter Block, he said usually those kind of training benefit the trainer much more than the trainee. Financially, experience-wise, and I have to admit that I've been a recipient of those benefits. But doing it that way, once again, violates a lot of these principles that we're talking about, including this next principle, involves students in planning and evaluation of their own instruction. Now this is one of the principles of adult education that we just kind of imported wholesale. Malcolm Knowles is the father of androgyny, which is the technical term for adult education. And he said, when applied to the organization of adult education, a democratic philosophy means that the learning activities will be based on real needs and interests of the participants. How often do we do this very in-depth investigation of the audience before we actually design the training? It doesn't happen all that often. So if we want interpretation to lead to development and management, then we have to see interpretation training as part of the development process. And that means training for multiple hats, and training in teams. And just give you some positive examples. Here's a training that I worked on in South Texas, and the guide training had a supervisor component to it, where they learned to try to use the guides. This is a supervisor of a property in McAllen, and she actually participated with the guides, so she became a very good consumer of interpretation. Working in Colombia, El Cucuy, we worked with local guides around a national park, but there was also a component to work with the Bogota-based tour operators, so that they would understand what we're working and try to link the local guides up with these supervisors, these providers in the big city, so that somebody would actually know about the products that were being worked on. I'm a big fan of Samham's thematic interpretation, so how do we apply that in the field? Here in Valle de Oro National Wildlife Refuge in Albuquerque, we're adding a participatory community component to creating thematic messages. So applying his theory on the ground through real practice with professional interpreters. Of course, frontline interpreters have to work with professionals to develop products. Planners and managers should work shoulder to shoulder. And I think you get the idea that it's really important that these functions are complementary and are necessary to produce a product that actually makes a difference on the ground. So where are we now then? So now we have different hats for different heads working as a team, but there's still something missing. Right? That alone, I mean, you're now, instead of an individual in isolation, you're a team in isolation. That's only a little bit better than where we were before. That is a sad thought, isn't it? No, how do we get them out of isolation? We need to put them where? We need to put them back into their context, right? So here, step over here, come into your organizational context, where you have to deal with all the political realities, the cultural realities, all the economic aspects, all of these different things that influence whether or not you can increase your performance as a team. And as a trainer, I need to the best of my ability, bring in that context into the training, because little good does it do to prepare this team who then has no possibility of dealing with the reality that they face. So this leads us to the next principle: develop individual and organizational performance, not just capacity. We all hear about capacity building, but if you think about it, capacity just means potential. And building potential is, if that's all you do, is useless, because the potential doesn't turn into real performance and it's wasted. And I'm not the only person who said that. This is an expert in international development, and he said, I'll read it for you, creating performance without building capacity is clearly not sustainable. That is, injecting a lot of money in so that something happens is creating performance without local capacity. And you take that money away, and of course everything collapses. But simply building capacity without motivating performance wastes that capacity, wastes that potential. And of course, we don't want to do that. So let's think about this here then. This hat looks like it might fit. It's adjustable. Better than the hat that I had before. Prestigious organization to boot. Hey, look at this. I'm a member of the team too. How about that? We'll step into my context. Join the team. Together, we will make better heritage conservation. You're not going to have the other 3 people come up? Oh, bring it on.
I got nuts.
Sorry. How about the camera? Costa Rica. That's it. We went pretty well, actually. point you out to a few resources that you're welcome to have. Over here we have brochures of our Heritage Interpretive Development Program and how we try to apply interpretation. You're welcome to take one of these. Here is the full set of our training principles and much bigger explanations of each of them. I only showed you about half of them, so half of them still can remain in mystery. You're welcome to take one of those. That will also be on the NAI website, and if you want the PDF or something for some other reason, just let me know. Excuse me, John. I also want to make a small plug, since it's not for profit, I don't feel a problem doing that. I have a blog called Heritage Interpretation. It's bilingual in English and Spanish, and probably at least a couple of you are already on it. Or you at least see some of the contributions on the NAI LinkedIn group. I don't post all of them, I just post some of the big stuff. Its emphasis is international development, because it's the only one in Spanish that I know of in the world, so it tries to offer some resources to developing countries, especially in Spanish. And frankly, I try to cover a lot of outside-the-box things that you won't find anywhere else in the interpretation of the world, as far as I can tell. So I'd like you to all ask yourselves, can my training be more holistic? Can your training be more oriented to helping conservation and management on the ground? Or is it enough to just be business as usual? With that, I think we have 10 minutes to go. 10 minutes to go for any questions. I'll put John down a little less.
So, have you got any questions for John?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
In principle, I agree with all of this. As a trainer, one of the challenges I face all the time is coming in with an independent saying, okay, it would be really tremendously beneficial to have all these various people come together, and in my training I try and incorporate how they go back and connect with those people. How have you, at least most of the time, managed to get in, Supervisor A or the diversity of heads and hats that you want in the training?
Sure.
So you get everybody moving.
That's a totally good question. It is challenging. If I'm not sure you do, but if the model that you use is simply responding to calls for proposals, where the terms of reference are already set, then you don't have much power over the situation. What we do, because we're a non-profit distributed with almost no overhead, and our staff members are basically consultants, we have the power to be patient. We have the power to enter into conversations. Our local facilitators in different parts of the world look for parks, look for opportunities, talk about the conversation, make presentations. This is a more holistic approach, a more development approach. It's like with the Rios Tropicales, I had been talking with them for 6 to 8 months before we finally actually decided to do it. They had invited me on a free trip to go on the river rafting, and I gave them a free experience planning evaluation. And having seen that, they decided they wanted to move forward. I'm sure I'm more than half responsible for the failure of that project. Maybe I didn't explain it well, but in theory it should have worked. It should have worked. So part of the part of the MO, that's what I'm trying to say, is finding potential opportunities before their money is even there. Again, we have the power to do that, to investigate possibilities before the money exists. Sometimes it already exists, and that's fine too. And begin these conversations and try to set up these and have these agreements. Also, as a global consortium, I used to be part of UNESCO as an ad hoc project. And UNESCO can kick open doors very easily. When we left UNESCO, because it was all top-down, and we ended up having failed projects because of that, it's like, well, we still need to be able to open doors. So as a consortium, we come with a few prestigious organizations with different people and organizations around the world. So people maybe listen to us a little more than if I were just an independent consultant. So there's that. I don't want to use that power to force them to make a decision. I just want to use that power to be able to sustain the conversation. That's an incomplete answer, of course. I'm sure it does.
So what have been your lessons learned with training local guides, and what interpretive principles do you think they relate to and get most excited by, just in your experience? And I realize you're working with a particular set of cultural groups in Latin and South America.
Right, well again, I'm not sure I would even call local guides interpretive. Again, I would obviously look for a situation where there is some kind of higher level guide or interpreter who can guide them, can use them strategically. I mean, they are. Are you going to answer that, or do you want to jump on?
apologize, and I know you said that you feel people violently disagree. I'm not violent,
Okay, Marisol.
but I do fundamentally disagree with that.
Can I answer her, or you want to piggyback her question?
Well, I work in Latin America, the Caribbean, and part of Roots and Shoots in Africa and all over the world. And local people, local guides, it's very much dependent on what they're interested in. And they do get excited about interpretive theories and being able to create and connect things. Very often it's the teacher who is not quite managing to teach certain principles to people where you can see that breakdown. So I'm actually very concerned about some of the things I would say. I agree with several of the things you're saying about teamwork and linking things together, but the concept that a local guide cannot be interpreter, or is not interested in interpretive theory is absolutely contrary to everything that I've seen in my 20 plus years of working with these groups. And I've actually asked people, what do you think about this? And I don't hear that agreement. That there is a hierarchy and a cognitive level, that if you have a native person that doesn't have a college education, they're not going to cognitively understand interpretive theories that we totally understand.
Mm-hmm. And part of what you're saying might answer some of your questions, because what are the things you would work with a local guide and what are things are not. So there are certain interpretive or techniques that interpreters use that I would agree that local guides can do. They can be very good storytellers, for instance. And when given an interpretive theme by the organization, if they're independent and there is no interpretive theme coming from somebody else, then that theme can be illustrated through story selection and through object selection and interpretation of objects. And in fact, that's what we work a lot on, is storytelling, communication techniques, how to use objects, how to interact with the larger organizations. I generally don't work with independent guides very much because there is very little control and there isn't as much capability of doing longer-term mentoring. So I think to get to a reconciliation between what you're saying and what I'm saying might come down to, well, which skills are you referring to specifically that you see operate? And maybe those skills that I see operate too in local guides, or maybe you're working under certain conditions that are different than the conditions I'm describing.
There are conditions in all different countries, and I think you need to get messier. I think that if you're looking at a group of people and you're trying to create a block of what they're going to understand and not understand, I don't think it's going to be effective. I think you need to look at individuals in your training, and you may have a PhD who doesn't understand interpretive principles and will never get it and never get that message. But you will also have a group of people, maybe all from the same indigenous group, who are going to have different levels of interest and awareness and understanding.
Absolutely.
And I can't believe that just taking the native guides and saying, well, this is where you are, and because you're never going to get to this level of education, you're not going to...
Let's go back to some of the principles I mentioned. Meeting people where they are, involving people in the design of the intervention. This is about knowing who they are before you design an intervention. Obviously, this is a global generality, because if you're not aware of psychological development, you can't be a psychologist. You really can't be an educator. You really can't be a trainer if you don't know how people develop psychologically.
Yes, but
you can be also
about their level of development based on, in a lot of ways, their socioeconomic background.
Say that again? You're assuming level of development? To some degree.
You're kind of clumping people together in a way
Yep.
that I think can be dangerous. I can
I agree.
understand we have to think in categories, but this is a very touchy one.
Well, I think it's an additional tool that you use in designing your education. If you ignore people's education level or their cognitive level, then you're potentially running into additional risks. If you have the resources and the luxury to understand, luxury is not the right word, if you have the resources to better understand your audience, hopefully you will do a much better product. You'll be much more targeted, much more participatory, much more relevant. I mean, I think that's the principles of development. So, yes, I understand how the categorization at this level of analysis does sound like pigeonholing and stereotyping. In practice, hopefully, you do actually know the people you're working with, and you've had sustained conversations with them and with their supervisors so that you can come up with the skill set that's most appropriate. But again, as a generality, and I can give you many, many examples, maybe not the ones you work on, of trainings that don't do that and have failed all around the world. I mean, and they're in the literature.
I've
There's
seen
lots of
trainings that
examples.
don't do
in
that
there.
and fails with highly educated, college-educated, developed country people.
Sure. The principle is not for developed. This principle is for humanity. It's not for developed countries. It's just more. The differences are more marked, more distinct and developed.
Okay, there was another lady with a question over there.
Oh, I was just going to say, I don't see a huge difference, because I look at it more as these are categories and roles. These are roles that have to be played. And I know in our work, we have people at that front line who are, they're the storytellers, they're the stars, they're the it. But we also have people in all those other roles that are part of the team, as I think you were trying to demonstrate here. So I think that it's not, it's just recognizing. I think you're both saying that you've got to recognize the individual and their capacity and capability. But you're kind of glossing over it a bit quicker. That's all.
Well, I am, and because in real life, you oftentimes get contracts, you get organizations who want training in a certain area. I mean, you're thinking right now in Trinidad. So you're going to have to think about, well, are the people who want to pay for this, are they just pumping a whole bunch of group of people together over you have no control over the selection of these people, you have no control over I don't know if this is true, hopefully you will have control, or whether supervisors will be involved, but now you know that these are factors that can influence the outcome. And oftentimes, we are stripped of those opportunities to influence the process, so we have to be more careful. I'm arriving a little late at the list of providers.
Well, I think we need to wind up now because it's just coming up to 9 o'clock. I think thanks very much for everybody's questions and the discussion as well.